Moving on to the gross anatomical structures of the brain, and the adult brain consists of four major parts: the brainstem, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the cerebrum. Each of those major parts or regions contains further gross anatomical structures, which are the relatively large structures of the brain that you can see without a microscope, as opposed to the microscopic structures like the neurons and the neuroglia that we covered earlier. Now, for this learning objective, I want you to be able to identify these structures on either a model or an image, as well as provide a brief description of what each of those structures do. Now, I appreciate that this is going to be a lot to cover in one learning objective, but we will go over these again both in the lab and in the online tutorial, where you'll be able to look at these structures both on images, plastic models, and in some cases on the cadavers in the lab. So if we start by taking a look at the four major regions or parts of the brain, and they were the brainstem, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the cerebrum. So the brainstem is this region here. It's continuous with the spinal cord and is made up of the structures the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Posterior to the brainstem is the cerebellum, which is often referred to as the little brain, and the cerebellum is this structure here. Superior to the brainstem is the diencephalon. The borders of the diencephalon are a little bit harder to distinguish, but it's this central mass of tissue here. Within the diencephalon, we find the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. And then sitting on top of our diencephalon is the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain and is made up of our four lobes, as well as the structures contained within them. So our cerebrum is this folded nervous tissue here. So beginning with the brainstem, and the brainstem is a part of the brain between the spinal cord and the diencephalon. So our spinal cord is this part here that then runs down the middle of our vertebral canal. The brainstem is made up of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. So the medulla, which you can also just refer to, the medulla oblongata, which you can also just refer to as the medulla, is this upper thickened part here, which is continuous with that top of the spinal cord. The pons is this rounded oval shape here, and then the midbrain is this little rectangle of tissue here. Taking a close look at the medulla, which remember is this bottom part here, and looking at it from an anterior or front-on point of view, and this is what it will look like. So a large portion of our medulla is made up of white matter, which remember is the axons of neurons which are myelinated. So the white matter in the medulla is made up of all of the sensory and motor tracts that extend between the spinal cord and other parts of the brain. So these are the axons of sensory neurons that transmit all of the sensory information from receptors in the body up to the brain, and the axons of all of the motor neurons that transmit information from the brain to our effectors. Now, some of this matter, white matter, forms bulges on the anterior aspect of the medulla, and we call these bulges the medullary pyramids. Our medullary pyramids are made up of the corticospinal tract, which is a collection of the myelinated axons that pass from the cerebrum to the spinal cord and control the voluntary movements of our limbs and our trunk. Now, these tracts do something a little bit funky just above the junction or the border between the medulla and the spinal cord. And that is that 90% of these axons actually cross over from the side that they originate from to the opposite side. So this crossing over is called decussation, and it explains why, as an example, the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body and vice versa. Now, aside from containing the corticospinal tracts, the medulla also contains several nuclei, which are clusters of neuron cell bodies in the central nervous system. So some of these nuclei control our vital bodily functions. For example, we have a nuclei called the cardiovascular center, which regulates the rate and the force of the heartbeat and the diameter of our blood vessels. We also have another nuclei called the medullary respiratory center, which adjusts the basic rhythm of breathing. Aside from regulating heart rate and breathing, nuclei in this region also control reflexes for vomiting, swallowing, sneezing, and coughing. Moving superiorly, and the pons is then this rounded section in the middle of the brainstem. And like the medulla, the pons consists of both nuclei and tracts. The tracts connect the left and the right sides of the cerebellum, the cerebrum and the cerebellum, and it also makes up some of our ascending sensory, so sensory information going up to the brain, and then descending motor tracts, so the information going from the brain down to the spinal cord. One of the major nuclei is the pontine respiratory group, which together with our medullary respiratory group helps control our breathing. The most superior section of the brainstem is then the midbrain. So the midbrain is this little section up here. Again, looking at it from another angle, and it's this portion here. Within our midbrain runs the cerebral aqueduct, which connects our third ventricle with our fourth ventricle. And like both the medulla and the pons, the midbrain contains both nuclei and tracts. So the anterior or the front portion of the midbrain contains bundles of axons which are called the cerebral peduncles. The cerebral peduncles consists of axons of the corticospinal tract, which we spoke about earlier, the corticobulbar tract, which controls muscles of the head and the neck, and the corticopontine tract, which connects the cerebral cortex to nuclei in the pons and is involved in the control and coordination of voluntary movements. The posterior portion of the midbrain is called the tectum, and it contains 4 rounded elevations. So 2 superior elevations, which are actually nuclei known as the superior colliculi, and then 2 inferior elevations, which are also nuclei known as the inferior colliculi. So our superior colliculi act as reflex centers for visual activities. So this includes things like being able to track a moving object with your eye. So a car drives past and you can keep focus on that object. Or it could be that you've got a book in front of you and you can scan the text on a stationary object. The inferior colliculi is part of the auditory pathway. So it relays neural impulses from the inner ear to the brain. Now, other nuclei in the midbrain, called the substantia nigra, extend to the basal nuclei, which historically we have referred to as the basal ganglia, which are several nuclei found deep within the brain, which release dopamine and are involved in the control of subconscious muscle activity. Now, I point these out because the loss of neurons in these areas is associated with diseases such as Parkinson's disease. Now, just to show you a different angle of the midbrain, because it is a bit of a hard structure to visualize sometimes, but here is the anterior side here with our cerebral peduncles. And then here is our posterior side here with our tectum, which has our superior colliculi, and then underneath that, our inferior colliculi. Now, before we move on to the next region of the brain, I do want to give you a little bit of a recap in text because I know that was a lot of information. Perhaps you might like to print out this summary and bring it to your lab so that when you try and identify some of these regions, you have a little bit more information with you. But our brainstem is made up of those 3 parts. So we have the medulla oblongata, which extends out from the top of the spinal cord, the pons, which sits on top of the medulla, and then the midbrain, which sits on top of that. So looking first at our medulla oblongata, and within the medulla we have our medullary pyramids, which are made up of the corticospinal tract, which controls voluntary movement of limbs and trunk. And I will also just point out that we will talk more about these tracts when we come to the neural pathways. One of the nuclei within the medulla oblongata is called the cardiovascular center, which regulates the rate and the force of our heartbeat, the diameter of our blood vessels. And then another nuclei called the medullary respiratory center, which helps adjust the basic rhythm of breathing. We then have the pons, which remember is that middle rounded part. Within the pons, we have the pontine respiratory group, which together with that medullary respiratory group helps control our breathing. And we also have our other pontine nuclei, which help relay nerve impulses from motor areas of the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum. And we'll learn more about the cerebellum shortly. The most superior section of our brainstem was the midbrain. We had those 4 rounded elevations, our superior and our inferior colliculi. Our superior colliculi are nuclei involved with visual reflexes. The inferior colliculi are nuclei involved with auditory reflexes. And then we also had those bumps, which we call the cerebral peduncles. These are made up of axons of the corticospinal, the corticobulbar, and the corticopontine tracts. And they conduct nerve impulses from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord, the medulla, and the pons. And again, we will cover each of those tracks in our neural pathways lecture. So the next major part or region of the brain is the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is the second largest region, only behind the cerebrum. And it's this inferior and posterior part here. So like the cerebrum, the cerebellum has a highly folded surface that greatly increases the surface area of its outer grey matter, which remember is the brain tissue that's made up of the neuron cell bodies, the dendrites, any unmyelinated axons, and all of our glial cells. So the cerebellum also plays a good role in being able to orient the brain. So the cerebellum is posterior. So if you can identify the cerebellum, you should know that this is the front and this is the back. So from a superior and an inferior angle, which is our view here on the left, the cerebellum kind of resembles a butterfly. So it has a central constricted area, which we call the vermis, and then it has lateral wings or lobes, which are the cerebellar hemispheres. Looking internally, which is this image here on the right, and the most superficial or outermost layer of the cerebellum is made up of grey matter, and deep to this are the white matter, so the tracts of white matter, which are called the arbor vitae, or more colloquially, the tree of life. Now, the primary function of the cerebellum is to evaluate how well movements initiated by motor areas of the cerebrum are actually being carried out. So it's a bit of a feedback system. And when movements initiated by the cerebrum are not being carried out correctly, the cerebellum detects these discrepancies. It then sends feedback signals to the motor areas of the cerebrum, and those feedback signals help correct the errors so that we have a smooth, coordinated, complex sequence of movements. Aside from this feedback cycle, the cerebellum is also the main brain region that regulates the posture and our balance. Now, to give you a little bit of a visual of the cerebellum, and this is a video of an individual who has a hemorrhage or significant bleeding in one side of his cerebellum. Now, I know there is sound on this video, but you don't actually need to hear what it says. But what I want you to look at is that as he reaches his right arm out and then brings it back to touch his nose, on the right-hand side, he has really normal function. He can make this movement relatively easily and smoothly. When he then tries with his left arm, You can see that this movement is quite shaky, and he's actually struggling to get that finger to stick to his nose. The feedback that the cerebellum detects of movements that are not carried out as intended are not being sent back to the cerebral cortex in this case to readjust the movement. So that movement's going to remain shaky and a little bit uncoordinated. So you can see between the left and the right arm the difference of having a functional and a non-functioning cerebellum. So again, a recap of the functions of the cerebellum in text. The cerebellum works to smooth and coordinate contractions of skeletal muscle and also regulate posture and balance. The next major brain region we will focus on is the diencephalon. And the diencephalon forms this central core nervous tissue. So it's just superior to the midbrain and it sits underneath the cerebrum. It's almost completely surrounded by those cerebral hemispheres, and it contains numerous nuclei involved in a wide variety of sensory and motor processing between higher and lower brain centers, which I will explain further in a second. The three structures that make up the bulk of the diencephalon, and which I want you to be able to identify and provide a brief function for, are the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. So the thalamus makes up the majority of the diencephalon, and it consists of two oval masses of grey matter, organised into nuclei, interspersed with tracts of white matter. So a lot there. It's two oval masses or two oval shapes, organised into nuclei and broken up by different tracts of white matter. On this image here on the left, the thalamus is this dark oval egg-shaped region in the middle. And then on the right, you can see the really clear two oval shapes. And then all of the different colours are representing the different nuclei. So the thalamus is the major relay station for most of the sensory impulses that reach the primary sensory areas of the cerebrum from the spinal cord and brainstem. It also contributes to motor function by transmitting information from the cerebellum and the basal nuclei to the primary motor area of the cerebral cortex. So the nuclei that make up the thalamus are grouped into several major regions based on their location, so actually where on the thalamus they sit, but also their function. So for example, this anterior nucleus receives input from the hypothalamus and it sends output to the limbic system. So it helps function in emotions and memory. The ventral anterior nucleus receives input from the cerebellum and the basal ganglia, and it sends output to motor areas of the cerebral cortex. So it plays a role in movement control. And then the medial genicular nucleus relays auditory impulses for hearing from the ear to the primary auditory area of the cerebral cortex. So our thalamus, which is what I'm just trying to demonstrate, acts as a relay station. The hypothalamus is a small part of the diencephalon located inferior to the thalamus and made up of a dozen or so nuclei. So the hypothalamus, if we look at this image here, is this little triangle shape here or this little triangle shape here. So it's just kind of this section where those coloured nuclei are. Now, the hypothalamus controls many body activities and it's considered one of the major regulators of homeostasis. So sensory impulses related to both somatic and visceral senses arrive at the hypothalamus, as do impulses from receptors for vision, taste, and smell. Other receptors within the hypothalamus itself continually monitor osmotic pressure or the water content of the blood, things like blood glucose levels, temperature, and the concentration of certain hormones. So, as part of its job as one of the major regulators of homeostasis, the hypothalamus is involved in the regulation of emotion and behaviour. It regulates food and water intake by causing a sensation of fullness or of thirst. It controls body temperature by stimulating activities that either promote heat loss or heat production and retention. And the other major function of the hypothalamus is the production of several hormones. And so this relates to its close association with the pituitary gland, which is this structure here. It hangs off the tip of the hypothalamus. And most of the hormones produced by the hypothalamus are known as releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. So these are released into the bloodstream, transported directly to the anterior pituitary gland, where they will stimulate or inhibit the secretion of hormones produced in this part of the gland. Other hormones produced by the hypothalamus, so these are mostly oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, are produced in the hypothalamus, but they then travel to the posterior pituitary gland, which is just this back part of the pituitary gland, and they are released by this gland. So the hypothalamus, one of the major regulators of homeostasis, and have a big role in the endocrine system due to its relationship with the pituitary gland. The final structure in the diencephalon is the epithalamus, which is this small region here, which is superior and posterior to the hypothalamus. So it's kind of a little bit up and behind the hypothalamus. Within the epithalamus is another endocrine gland called the pineal gland. And the pineal gland secretes the hormone melatonin. So melatonin is the hormone which is thought to promote sleepiness. And as more melatonin is produced in darkness compared to when it is light, that's why we think it's related to being sleepy and going to sleep. The synthetic version of melatonin has gained, popularity as a sleep aid for children, although the safety of such supplements, at the moment is a little unclear. And some individuals will also take it to help adjust to jet lag. So once again, recapping that in text for you, we have the hypothalamus, which is that central oval-shaped core of tissue. It acts as a relay station for sensory impulses that reach primary sensory areas of the cerebrum and between the cerebellum and the primary motor area of the cerebrum. We have the hypothalamus, which is our major regulator of homeostasis and controls body activities like hunger and thirst, temperature and emotions. We also produce hormones in our hypothalamus that we transport and then secrete through our pituitary gland. And then our epithalamus, which contains our pineal gland, which secretes the hormone melatonin. And melatonin is thought to promote sleepiness. So our final major region or part of the brain is the cerebrum. And a cerebrum is this folded structure up here. Now, the cerebrum provides us with the ability to read, to write, to think, to make calculations, compose music, to be able to remember the past, but then also plan for the future, to imagine things that have never existed. And the cerebrum is where our higher order brain activity occurs. So I said I would come back to that. Our higher order brain activity are the complex cognitive functions and processes that are associated with the cerebral cortex. And they include the integration of information from various sensory modalities. It involves memory, reasoning, decision-making, and other aspects of, advanced cognitive processing. So these are the cognitive functions that allow us to problem solve, to understand and navigate social situations, to have conscious awareness, and to be able to learn, adapt, and display creativity. So the cerebrum consists of an outer cerebral cortex, an internal region of white matter, and then grey matter nuclei deep within that white matter. The cerebrum can then also be broken up into the 4 lobes of the brain. So looking first at the cerebral cortex, and the cerebral cortex is the region of grey matter that forms the outer rim of the cerebrum. Although it's only 2 to 4 millimeters thick, the cerebral cortex contains billions of neurons arranged in layers. So our cerebral cortex is this dark purple layer around here. Now, during embryonic development, so while a baby is still in the womb, when the size of the brain increases really rapidly, the grey matter of the cortex grows at a much faster rate than the white matter that's within it. So as a result, the cerebral cortex rolls and folds upon itself, giving it this distinctive folded pattern. Now, within the cerebral cortex, the folds, or the grooves, I guess, which protrude out from the cortex, so these bits here, or here, or here that stick out, are known as the gyri, or if you're talking about the singular, it's the gyrus. The shallow folds inwards, so let's say this one here, are called the sulci, or the singular is a sulcus. And then our larger or deeper grooves, so for example, this one here, which separates the left and the right hemisphere, or this one here, which is our lateral fissure here, are called fissures. So not like the animal, F-I-S-S-U-R-E-S. Now, those gyri, sulci, and fissures form the boundaries between the lobes and other structures, and are primarily used to identify different brain regions rather than have any functional differences between them. So the longitudinal fissure, which is the most prominent fissure or deep groove, separates our cerebrum into the left and the right halves, called the left and the right hemispheres. So this is one hemisphere, this is our other hemisphere. Internally, the left and the right hemispheres are connected by a broad band of white matter, which remember is our myelinated axons, called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is what actually allows the 2 hemispheres of the brain to connect and to communicate, which is really important. Each cerebral hemisphere is then further subdivided into the 4 lobes of the brain. The lobes are named after the bones that cover them. For example, the frontal lobe, aside from just being at the front, is covered by the frontal bone of the skull. The border of each lobe is identified by a prominent gyri, sulci, or fissure. And within each lobe are further structures or regions which each have a specific function. So if we start off looking at the frontal lobe, which we've highlighted in blue on this image down here, and the frontal lobe sits obviously at the front of the brain and is separated from the parietal lobe, which is this yellow lobe here, posteriorly by the central sulcus. So that's this indent along here. And from the temporal lobe, which is this green part here, by our lateral fissure, so a deep indent. Within the frontal lobe are 2 important regions, which I do want you to be aware of, the primary motor cortex and the prefrontal cortex. So the primary motor cortex, which I will elaborate on in a second, is found in the precentral gyrus. So the gyrus, which is the ridge pre or before the central sulcus. So if this is our central sulcus here, this ridge is going to be our precentral gyrus. And the primary motor cortex is the region of the brain where all nerve impulses that voluntary innervate skeletal muscle arise from. So every time we make a voluntary muscle contraction, the nerve impulse arises from this part of the brain. The prefrontal cortex then sits at the front of the frontal lobe, and it plays a crucial role in many of our higher order cognitive functions. So things like our decision making, how our personality is expressed, being able to control our emotions, working memory, attention, are all related to our prefrontal cortex. Now, compared to other animals, the human frontal lobe is very well developed, and it's believed that this part of the brain is what actually sets us apart from other animals in terms of our intellect. Moving posteriorly, so towards the back of the brain, and here we have the parietal lobe. And as we just mentioned, the parietal lobe is separated from the frontal lobe by our central sulcus, and from our occipital lobe, which is this pink part here, by our parieto-occipital sulcus, which is this little bit here. One of the most important structures in the parietal lobe is the primary somatosensory cortex, which sits in our post-central gyrus. So now it's the gyrus, or the ridge posterior to the central sulcus. And it's the region of the brain that receives all somatic sensations. So somatic sensations refer to the sensory information from the skin, the muscles, the joints, and all our other tissues. And it encompasses sensations like touch, pressure, temperature, pain, and proprioception. So anytime we perceive any of those sensations, the impulse has gone to this part of the brain here. Now, elaborating a little further on our primary motor and our primary somatosensory cortices, because these will become important regions of the brain for many of you as you move through your degrees. And so the primary motor area, or primary motor cortex, which is located in the pre-central gyrus, so remember that bit in front of the central sulcus, is a bit like a map of the entire body, with each region within this area controlling voluntary contractions of specific muscles or groups of muscles. So the different muscles or muscle groups are not all represented equally, but more cortical area, so more, brain tissue, is actually devoted to muscles involved in skilled, complex, or delicate movements. So movements that require more precision and more control. For example, the cortical region devoted to the muscles of the fingers. So if we look up here, this is the muscles of the fingers and the hand. Muscles that require really precise control. So if you think about playing the piano or signing your name, that's quite a controlled movement. These are much larger than, let's say, the muscles of our legs, even though the muscles of our legs are actually physically much larger. Now, this distorted or unequal map of the human body is called the motor homunculus. Our primary somatosensory cortex, or primary somatosensory area, is located immediately posterior to the primary cortex. The primary motor cortex. It sits in our post-central gyrus, so this green part here. And the primary somatosensory cortex receives nerve impulses for touch, pressure, vibration, itch, tickle, temperature, pain, and proprioception. So like the primary motor area, in our primary somatosensory area, we have a map of the entire body, with each point within that map receiving nerve impulses from a specific part of the body. Again, the size of the cortical area receiving those sensory impulses from a particular part of the body depends not on the size of that part of the body, but the number of receptors that are present in that area. So again, if we use our fingers as an example, the fingertips are really sensitive and they contain a high number of sensory receptors in a small space. So that's why they represent quite a large portion of this map. Similar to our lips, our teeth, and our face, rather small structures, but they have lots and lots of receptors in that small area, so it represents a greater cortical space compared to, again, say our legs, which in real life has a bigger region, but they're less sensitive, there's less receptors in that area, so it needs a smaller amount of cortical space. This distorted map is called our sensory homunculus. Now, this map is what allows you to pinpoint the exact location where somatic sensations originate. So for example, even with your eyes closed, you know exactly where to swat when a mosquito lands on your arm. You don't actually need to see that mosquito. So back to our lobes, and the occipital lobe, which is this pink part at the back of the brain here, is separated from our parietal lobe by that parieto-occipital sulcus, and then from our cerebellum by this transverse fissure. So that's this fissure that runs all the way along here. And a specific sulcus or fissure does not actually separate the occipital from the temporal lobe. We kind of just draw an imaginary line extending from the pre-occipital notch, which is this little indent here, up to our parieto-occipital sulcus. Now, importantly, the occipital lobe houses the primary visual cortex, which receives all of the visual information from our eyes. The occipital lobe also contains a number of association areas, which we will speak more about shortly, that are specialised for different visual tasks, such as visual spatial processing, colour differentiation, and also motion perception. Our last lobe is the temporal lobes, and they sit laterally on either side of the brain. The temporal lobe extends superior to the sylvian fissure, which is this line here, also known as the lateral fissure, and it separates it from the frontal lobe and also the parietal lobe. The temporal lobe consists of structures that are important for long-term memory, such as the hippocampus. It also contains the primary auditory cortex, which processes auditory information, and auditory association areas that allows us to understand what a sound means and understand things like speech and language. So the hippocampus, I just wanted to point out and make mention of separately. The hippocampus is a small region located in the medial portion of the temporal lobe, so it's quite deep within the cerebrum or the cerebral cortex. And the hippocampus plays a key role in the formation, the consolidation, and the retrieval of both short-term and long-term memories. It's also essential for spatial learning and helping individuals navigate and remember their environment. So how we learn to walk to and from the coffee shop, for example. In memory disorders, conditions like Alzheimer's disease, the hippocampus is one of the first areas that will actually be damaged or affected. So it's often significantly shrunk in size. And this damage to the hippocampus is what's believed to lead to the characteristic memory loss and cognitive decline associated with these types of diseases. It's often why individuals with Alzheimer's disease will often get lost and may have trouble finding their way home. Another structure in the cerebrum I wanted to point out are our association areas. And association areas make up large portions of each of the lobes and are connected with one another by lots of association tracks. So whereas primary sensory areas, such as the primary visual cortex, they receive and process incoming sensory information, our association areas will deal with more complex integrative functions. So things like memory, emotions, reasoning, judgment, and intelligence. So they don't just process a signal, they actually integrate lots of signals and determine an outcome. Now, as an example of some of these functions, the somatosensory association area sits just behind the primary somatosensory area, and it allows us to determine the exact shape and texture of an object just by feeling it. So you think you can put your hand in your pocket and you can pull out, let's say, a $2 coin without even looking at it. You can just feel what it feels like in your pocket. It also helps us recognize what an object is. So things like a pencil or a paper clip, again, simply by feeling it. The facial recognition area, which corresponds roughly to areas 20, 21, and 37. So these regions here on this image. These receives nerve impulses from the visual association areas, and it stores information about faces. So that's when you actually get information about someone's face and you can tell who that person is. So there are people in the world who have damage to this part of the brain, and they can see a face 100 times and still not determine who that person is. We have an auditory association area, which is located inferior and posterior to the primary auditory cortex. This association area allows us to recognize particular sound as either speech, music, or noise. So that primary auditory area will actually get the impulses about the sound, but this auditory association area will go, yep, okay, that's someone talking, or that's some music playing in the background. The prefrontal cortex, sometimes also called the prefrontal association area, we talked about earlier, but it has numerous connections with the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the limbic system, and the cerebellum. It plays a large role in the makeup of someone's personality, of their intellect, of their ability to learn, reason, recall information. The premotor area is the motor association area immediately anterior to the primary motor area. So neurons in this area communicate with the primary motor cortex, the sensory association areas, the basal nuclei, and the thalamus. This area deals with learned motor activities of a complex and sequential nature. So for example, it generates the motor impulses that cause specific groups of muscles to work together in a specific way to do things like run, or to do things like write, or do something like hopscotch. Lastly, we have Wernicke's area, which is found in the left temporal and parietal lobes. And this area helps interpret the meaning of speech. So it helps recognize spoken word. It's active as you translate words into thoughts. And individuals with damage to this part of the brain can still speak, but they actually struggle to form words into sentences in a coherent fashion. So take those thoughts they're thinking and putting it into a logical sentence. Now, I don't expect you to understand or remember each of those different motor association areas or sensory association areas. I just wanted to give you some examples of what an association area does. Two other structures or groups of structures that I also wanted to make note of, but are not strictly found within only the cerebrum, are the limbic system and the basal ganglia or the basal nuclei. The limbic system is a set of structures within the brain that sit on both sides of the thalamus, so right under the cerebrum. And it's not a separate structure, but a collection of structures from the cerebrum, the diencephalon, and the midbrain. Now, the limbic system supports many different functions, including emotion, behaviour, motivation, long-term memory, and olfaction or smell. And it's the part of the brain that is involved when it comes to behaviours that we need for survival. So things like feeding, like reproducing, caring for our young, or the fight and flight responses. So often called the emotional brain, the limbic system combines our higher ordered cognitive functions and our emotion. The pleasure centre of the brain is also located in the limbic system, which is activated during activities like sexual arousal, the high that you get from particular recreational drugs, and also engaging in a rewarding activity, whether that be achieving a goal or eating a slice of chocolate cake. The basal nuclei, which I mentioned earlier, historically has been called the basal ganglia, are a group of deep brain structures that work together to control your body's movement. So these structures are involved in modulating voluntary motor movements by influencing the initiation, the execution, and actually the termination or stopping of movements. So key structures within the basal nuclei include the striatum, the globus pallidus, and the substantia nigra. These structures work together to regulate the balance between excitatory and inhibitory signals in the motor circuits. So sometimes those inhibitory signals are just as important. Dysfunction of the basal nuclei have been implicated in various movement disorders such as Parkinson's disease and also Huntington's disease. So that was a lot, but a recap in text for you. We have the cerebral cortex, which is the layer of the brain which is highly folded. The ridges form gyri, the shallow grooves form sulci, and the deep grooves form fissures. We have the corpus callosum, which is the thick bundle of nerve tracts which connect the right and the left hemispheres. The frontal lobe is the well-developed lobe at the front of the brain. It contains our primary motor cortex and also association areas related to movement, cognition, and personality. We have the parietal lobe, which is posterior to the frontal lobe and houses our primary somatosensory cortex. We have the occipital lobe, which is the lobe at the posterior or the back of the brain. It houses our primary visual cortex and several visual association areas. Our temporal lobe are the lobes on the lateral sides of the brain. So they house our primary auditory cortex, our auditory association areas, and also the hippocampus, which remember is that part of the brain involved in memory. The primary motor cortex is located within the precentral gyrus, so that ridge in front of our central sulcus, and is a region of the cerebrum which controls voluntary movement of muscles or muscle groups. Located within the postcentral gyrus, so the ridge posterior to our central sulcus, is the region of the cerebrum which receives all the nerve impulses for our somatic sensations. Our association areas are the interconnected regions of the cerebrum with projections to other areas that are involved in the complex integration and higher order cognitive functions, things like memory, intelligence, reasoning, and judgment. Hippocampus, we've mentioned, is involved in the formation, consolidation, and retrieval of short and long-term memories and spatial learning and navigation. The limbic system is often termed the emotional brain and is involved in functions including motivation, learning, emotions, pleasure, eating, and olfaction. And lastly, our basal nuclei, which have been known as our basal ganglia, modulate voluntary motor movements by influencing the initiation, execution, and termination of motor movements. Now, just before we finish this learning objective, I just want to point out lots of structures and lots of different functions. You don't need to know each of the functions for every single structure.